My name is Elizabeth Thill, Thill, and I am the program director and associate professor of classical studies at IU Indianapolis. And I am honored to be hosting our talk today. And before we jump into the meat of why we're here, the reason we're here, I want to do our introduction slides. So this is the AIA Archaeology Hour that is sponsored by the Archaeological Institute of America. And if you are interested in following us, you can see our various handles on the screen, or you could just Google it and it'll come up. Who is the AIA? We are the largest and oldest archaeological membership. We are the primary institution, especially for classical archaeology, for the archaeology of the Mediterranean world. But as our talk today demonstrates, thankfully, we are not just the Romans and the Greeks. That would get very boring and very tunic filled very quickly. We are educators, we are archaeologists, we run excavations, we give lectures, and we are also happy to support archaeology going forward. So we really are an institution dedicated to saving, discovering, studying, understanding the human past, the world together. If you would like to learn more, and we are not just professionals, we try to use not as much jargon as we might in our brains. If you would like to come into the world of the AIA, I would encourage you to look at Archaeology magazine. It's a fabulous magazine. It's a wonderful synthesis of not only what is being found in the world, it's not just like, and then they found this, and then they found this, but the newest lines of research, the newest ways of thinking about the past, the newest technology that's being brought to bear. It's really a good insight. If you feel like you need more jargon in your life and you need more Latin and Greek terms, don't worry, we got you covered. You can also subscribe to the American Journal of Archaeology, which is published through the AIA. The American Journal of Archaeology is the preeminent journal in the field of classical archaeology. It's the happiest thing you can publish in. You get so excited if you get published in the AJA. So I encourage you to take a look online on that as well. There are lots of different ways besides reading that you can be part of the archaeology and part of the AIA. There are a lot of excavations going on that are everything from massive projects with 300 people running nearly year-round to small test excavations with maybe 10 people in the field. You can learn more about that through the website. And if you're interested in participating, there's ways to do that too, so check it out. We have local societies where people get dressed up in funny clothes. So you're more than welcome to join that as well. And we have in-person lecture series sponsored through our local societies. So the local society for tonight's lecture is the AIA Central Indiana chapter, CIN. And they also have a lot of tours. So if you're looking to get out of the country and see some cool archaeology with some cool people, this is a great way to do it. Here is a QR code. You can become an AIA member, join the community. If you are a student and you're interested in becoming a member of the AIA, we have very affordable rates. With inflation, I think it's only like $2 million now. So I admit I forgot to look up how much it is, but it is purposely very affordable for students, both undergraduates and graduates, or younger, if your parents are letting you stay up this late. Why might you join besides just to be cool? You are eligible for AIA fellowships and grants. You can serve on committees, you can be part of the steering mechanism that shapes our understanding of archaeology. You can get $100 off your first AIA tour, which you can then immediately apply to wonderful food in Italy or wherever you're going. You get discounts at the meeting registration if you want to come and listen to a lot of jargon in person. And you also get archaeology subscription. So along with that, it's actually really a good deal. Even my mom thinks so. And if you are feeling generous tonight, I would encourage you to look into donating to the AIA. As you can imagine, there's not a ton of money flowing into the careful examination of the past at this moment, or really any moment. And so we rely on the support of donors to make this possible. And the AIA is a very well-run institution that knows what it's about and has been here for over a century now. And so it's a very uh, productive way to support archaeology. And I believe that's my last slide. Usually it ends with a plea for money. Oh, no, we have virtual lectures coming up. So not the ones that have already passed, because that's how time works as an archaeologist. I can let you know. But there will be more coming forward. And if you've missed some, the lectures are also posted on the YouTube channel. Oh, no, I need to remind you. We are going to be recording this lecture so that it can go on the YouTube channel because, again, that's how time works. But we very, very much ask that you do not record yourself. That's just rude and also, I think, illegal in some states. I'm not sure. I'm not a lawyer. I'm an archaeologist. So please do not record the lecture on your own. All right. And today I am happy to introduce Dr. Uzma Rizvi. She is at the Pratt Institute. And I am realizing I can't see my introduction that I wrote for her. So I'm going to stop sharing because you're going to get to look at her anyway, her beautiful face. And I'm going to pull up my introduction. She is a professor of anthropology and urban studies at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. She holds degrees from the University of Pennsylvania and Bryn Mawr College and a postdoctoral fellowship from Stanford University. And she is also visiting faculty in the Department of Archaeology at Shah Abdul Latif University in Pakistan. She is an anthropological archaeologist, specializing in the archaeology of the first cities. And she has a specialization in decolonizing methodologies, which is a very important part of the work that we do these days, is making sure that, we're not rolling in with troves of people carrying trunks and then we put everything in it and we leave. That's frowned upon these days. That's bad. So without much more ado, Dr. Rizvi, I'll hand it over to you. And thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that introduction and for the whole framing of the AIA. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate your sense of humor, actually. I've always enjoyed AIA talks, and so it's with a particular pleasure that I'm speaking to all of you to kick off this year, 2025's AIA Archaeology Hour. I'm going to share my screen, so please bear with me for a second while I get this slideshow up and running. I wanted to thank AIA, in particular, Danny Tutak and Meredith Langlitz, for the invitation and for all of this logistical support. Also on the back end, helping today with the Zoom, I just want to acknowledge both David DeVore and Abby Mason. Thank you for everything that you're doing that we can't see. Additionally, I wanted to acknowledge both Jasmine Marin and Billy Sims, who are going to be interpreting the event for our ASL viewers, and Wanda Krieger, who coordinates the ASL interpretation. I think this is really important. I'm really glad that we're doing this here at AIA. And of course, all of you. Thank you so much for being with us here virtually. I loved seeing all that chat with everyone's locations and the hellos and the laughter and everything else. I really appreciate all of you. So, as Liz mentioned, I'm a professor of anthropology and urban studies at Pratt Institute, which is situated in Lenape-Hoking, the traditional and unceded homeland of the Lenape past, present, and future. So the work I'm presenting today has been supported by multiple institutions, government agencies, and grants. And I just wanted to make sure to start with that kind of acknowledgement of the financial and logistical support provided by these organizations. The research work I'm presenting today is also part of, and it's undertaken by LIAV, which is the Laboratory for Integrated Archaeological Visualization and Heritage. LIAV makes connections between technology, archaeological data management, and heritage practice. We are a feminist, anti-colonial, and anti-racist platform focused explicitly on undoing colonial harm through generative rather than extractive work, and specifically around interdisciplinary archaeological research. So just to start us off, just to give you a sense of who we are, I'm the PI or the principal investigator of LIAV, and I'm joined by two directors, Sarah Eichner, who's the director for geospatial visualization, and Greg Smith, who is our director of mapping, digital cartography, and survey. One of our projects, the main project that we're working on right now, is the 3rd millennium BCE archaeological site of Mohenjo-Daro, which is in Sindh, Pakistan. And I'll be presenting a facet of that research today in my talk on care at Mohenjo-Daro. Now, this sort of work is never done alone, right? We work in collaboration with government officers, with students from Pakistan and the United States, and faculty from other institutions who join us depending on what sorts of research we're engaged in at that time. We intentionally create collaborative environments where communities of folks can join in on the conversations and talk about the site and significance. And you're seeing a multitude of different groups here, some of our teams, but we have students up here. I'm going to use my pointer. I hope you can see it. You may not be able to. Let's see. Top left. I'm jet lagged. I just got back from Pakistan, so I'll be doing left and right a lot. So top left, where you see that selfie, those are students from Shah Abdul Latif University. We have some elders right below them, and that was part of our interviews or ethnographic conversations. You then have some team members in the middle, some museum work that we did on the top right, some elders again on the bottom right. So it's kind of a mix of different folks. I had a lot more photos. I had to kind of pare it down just so that you could at least see who's in charge. Okay. So let's zoom out for a minute and talk about where we are in the world. So here's Pakistan, where you see the big sort of dot there. With India to the east and Afghanistan to the west, we have Central Asia to the north, and to the south, we have the Arabian Sea. Over the course of the last century, many archaeological sites belonging to the 3rd millennium BCE that share the similar cultural markers with Mohenjo-Daro have been documented. And many of those you see here, those little black dots, these are considered mature Harappan sites. And we have a lot more now. But this, I just wanted to give everyone kind of a context. And I particularly like this map because it shows you the location of Mohenjo-Daro within a vibrant landscape of many other smaller villages and hamlets and towns and cities to give us a sense of how vibrant this ancient landscape was. And so I hope you can see, I don't know if you can see the pointer, but if you can, here's Mohenjo-Daro. I'm just kind of pointing to it right here. In the middle, it's just above Kot Diji and just to the east of the word India, or to the west of the word India, if you can see that. Okay, so now
We
let's
can see your pointer.
Oh, you can? Thank you, Elizabeth. I appreciate that because I was like, who knows? It's the thing with Zoom. So now let's zoom into Mohenjo-Daro itself. This is a Google Earth image, something that people are familiar with. And this is the satellite image of the World Heritage Site. You can see the archaeological mound. And now that I know you can see my pointer, I'm going to just circle it again. You can see how it's a little dark red. And you can see kind of a little bit of the mud brick on the sides here, which is often a lighter brown. Just so you have some sense of scale, the site is about 240 hectares in size. So if you want to kind of think through that, it's about 3 miles around. It was inscribed in 1980 as a World Heritage Site, and only a third of the site has been excavated. And you can kind of see the excavated areas here. This is the Mount of the Great Bath. You can see DK, which we're going to spend some time in. HR and VS are right under here. There's some more excavated, but I'll show you more images where you can really see it. So this archaeological site is located in a semi-arid region of Sindh. And it's situated, really interestingly, on this Pleistocene ridge in the floodplain of the Indus River. The ancient city is situated between the Indus to the west and the Ghaggar Hakra to the east, which makes it ideal both for trade as well as for farming because of the alluvial floodplains. And in fact, I don't know if you can see down here, you can see the river right there, and you can see how that impacts agriculture there. So here's a more traditional plan of the site itself. Archaeological excavations at Mohenjo-Daro document hundreds of dwellings and large buildings constructed along streets and lanes oriented towards cardinal points, which index the architectural sophistication of a very well-planned city. So its discovery and early research by R.D. Banerjee recognized it as part of the third millennium, with subsequent excavations over the next 40 years, uncovering the densely built-up area. And it generated continued studies on the material culture until present. There's a lot that's been written about things, right? Contemporary studies expand on these earlier ones, including studies addressing hierarchical approaches to political organization, different experiences of the city, the semiotic approaches to narratives and mythology of the Indus. And here I'm just thinking of all this literature that this work has produced as a study. The last major excavation that was carried out by George Dales was 1964-65, after which excavations were banned due to the problem of conserving the exposed structures from weathering and the rising water table. So salt is a major issue, a conservation issue here because of the rising water table and capillary action. What ends up happening is that salt kind of expresses itself as an efflorescence on the outside of the brick. So small-scale excavations and coring have been conducted like over the last maybe 2 decades with considerable care and concern for conservation, but no large-scale excavations have happened because of this. So visually arresting due to its elevation, the western mound at Mohenjo-Daro, and that's this one right here, has been called the Stupa Mound because it's got a stupa on it, the Citadel or the Acropolis, or the Mound of the Great Bath. This is spatially separated, you can see right here, from the lower town, right here. Now, what's really interesting of this separation is that this area here is on an artificial platform. It's not actually a mound, it's not a geological mound. So this lower town is separated by this construction of artificial platform or substructure upon which structures are still visible today. This artificial mound, which is about 400 meters by 200 meters, consists of a huge retaining wall with inner fillings surmounted by structures. The buildings visible on the surface are made primarily of fired brick, and there's some evidence of some structures having timber as well. That's part of the reconstruction. So now to the east of the mound is this large lower town. And this is made up of numerous lower mounds that have been excavated over the years, including, and here I'm just going to point some out, DK area, HR area, which is down here to the south, VS and SD areas, which is, we've got SD here. This area has been excavated. And I think it's important because archaeologists working at Mohenjo-Daro consider these areas to have been vibrant urban neighborhoods. There's a lot going on here. And it's one of these neighborhoods, DKG, that we'll be focusing on in our study. So our work draws upon it and emerges through the engagement with previous studies done in the neighborhoods of Mohenjo-Daro. Work done more broadly on ways to consider what a neighborhood even means in an ancient South Asian context, as well as approaches to 3D modeling, because we use a lot of LiDAR, we use 360 videos, we make 3D models, we're doing photogrammetry with drones, all of this in the service of assisting a visualization of the data sets that we're working with. So one of the things that I think is always kind of important and somewhat fun to do is to really get a sense of the site by seeing it and experiencing it, because there's a very visceral sense. So this was some drone footage that we took. This right here is the stupa mound that you can see, so that you can actually see the stupa here. The Great Bath we just passed by. This is some of the excavated areas. The Indus River is out on the horizon, right? So you can kind of see this. This drone footage was taken, I think, just like a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago. So we're still processing a lot of this data, but I'd like us to have a kind of visual understanding of the landscape that we're looking at and the areas that have been excavated and that have not been excavated. All of this white kind of on the top that you see is actually salt. There's a lot of salt there. So this is VS area. We've got a little bit of George Dales area, HR areas down there. We're moving east and the camera, just that you know what direction we're headed in. The reason I selected this particular sort of image, or this moving image, this drone footage, was because the area of Munir area and the other DK areas often aren't seen when people do presentations. And so I really wanted to make sure that people understood just the expanse of how large these neighborhoods must have been. All these areas in between are unexcavated, but most likely, when we walk it, you see material everywhere. It's like scattered. So it's a very dense city, right? And this is the Munir area. As we're gonna start turning north, we're gonna see some of the other DK areas that were excavated. And you'll also see the airport. So Mohenjo-Daro has an airport that was built on the site itself so that dignitaries could come and visit, or when there are kind of important events. Although now I don't believe they allow planes to land. The first time I visited Mohenjo-Daro, I did fly into Mohenjo-Daro, and it was kind of an interesting. And so what you see in front, I don't know if you can see the runway right here, and this is where the airport is. That we kind of like as we were landing, I looked out of the window and I could see DKG, and I was just like, we're landing on the site, and that's why they've stopped kind of flying as much. It's not as active anymore. Now it's used mostly for, I think, emergencies, because it was actually rattling the site. Now, as we turn this corner we're going to be looking at DK from the north. And so this is DKG, this beautiful sun. I mean, the suns are just gorgeous. You'll see lots of sunsets in any images that I show. This here is the area of DKG. This is DKG North, and this is DKG South. A vast majority of all the work that we're doing actually is in DKG South. So again, it's important to get a sense of what it looks like rather than just looking at top-down plans. I think there's a different kind of visualization that's possible today. And so I think that's really important because it changes the ways in which we approach an archaeological site and how we actually understand and understand kind of what is possible to imagine at that time. Another mode of sort of visualization that we've been using is a 360 video. And so this allows us to then, I'm just going to pause it. Oh, it goes so fast. This allows us to really get a sense of what the space looks like when you're standing in it. So I'm about 5'5", 5'6" on a good day. Sometimes I like to consider myself 5'7", but that's roughly what you're looking at, right? And I'm just holding my phone, and I used a 360 app to take just a visual of the area that we just saw from above. This is in DKG. We're in house 5, and which is in block 7, which is part of what we just saw. That's a well, but just to get a sense, just a sheer sense of how much brick we have here and what we're working with. So I think so these sorts of visualizations are really important and are very much a part of what we're trying to do at LIA, is to bring archaeology a different kind of visualization and a different kind of understanding of data, right? Just understanding data differently. So this research, as I mentioned, is focused on this neighborhood of DKG South, and it relies on the archaeological excavations conducted under the guidance of Ernest Mackay. Now, the data resulting from these excavations was generated through the labor of many archaeologists, anthropologists, excavators, and others whose work produced the core set of information that we utilize. Large-scale excavations started in the DK area on the 22nd of December, 1927. And it went on until the 9th of March, 1928. During that first season, Mackay was assisted by Mr. Majumdar, who was the assistant superintendent of archaeology for explorations. He was also assisted by Mr. H.L. Srivastava, who's a scholar in that same department. And the excavation assistant was Mr. Devi Dayal Mathur. In the second season, which was 24th of October, 1928 to 26th of March, 1929, Mackay was assisted by Mr. Majumdar again for a short period of time, as well as, and Mr. Srivastava also continued through the season. There was an addition of an anthropologist, Mr. Roy, who joined in from Calcutta University. So just to get a sense of just like how academically vibrant this time period was as the excavations were happening. So Mr. Srivastava actually continued on with McKay for both seasons, 3 and 4, which is between 1929 and 30 and 1930 and 31. So we're looking at excavations that happened between 1927 all the way to 1931. That's kind of like our span. Mr. Puri serves as excavation assistant for seasons 2 through 4, and the plans that this study that we've heavily relied on as we create these 3D images were drawn by Mr. Mukherjee, Mr. Nawabuddin, and Mr. Mohiuddin. Now, these folks are important for many different reasons, but specific to what we're looking at today, they show up in the archive as well. Just a couple weeks ago, I was documenting accession cards, not even a couple weeks, like, yeah, maybe a couple weeks ago. I was documenting accession cards of these excavations. And it's sitting in Mohenjo-Daro at the museum there in the curator's office and going through this older material. And I was reading the notes that were left by Mr. Srivastava and Mr. Puri in the records. Reading their names on artifact cards makes a difference because I know how involved they were with the excavations as well. So there's a sense that they have a context within which they're establishing information and a record about the artifacts being excavated. Now, just to give you an example, here's one example. Oh, not that example. See if I can get there. There we go. Here's an example of one such card from February 27th, 1931. The card states that it is a fragment of copper from the early levels at DKG based on the depth of the excavation. On the back side of the accession card, which is this one down here, Ernest Mackay left a note saying on the same day, right, on the 27th, 31, saying that it was sent for analysis. And here's his signature, EM, with the date. And so we have many such examples of notes on cards. And creates a way for us to really understand kind of what was actually happening on the ground when the excavations were going on. And it's important for us to have that opportunity to reconstruct the ways by which work happened at the site and to identify moments of interpretation so that we might re-examine that moment today in 2025 and maybe interpret things differently if needed, right? It is clear that a lot of care went into the documentation and study of the site. And it really is that care that we want to consider as well. So care at Mohenjo-Daro invites us to access scholarship and knowledge in a different way. While utilizing a decolonial, non-extractive, and generative approach within a framework that emphasizes care at the site. Our interlocution with the archaeological site, the legacy data, the site labor, and the archival history allows us to explore the notion of care across time and data sets. The materiality of care at Mohenjo-Daro can be identified through repair and restoration in antiquity of household units through time, through the upkeep and maintenance of sanitation infrastructure, and through urban design decisions that are made with multiple stakeholders in mind, such as locations of wells and trash bins. Each of these aspects can be documented in detail utilizing remote sensing. And Ethica Care allows us to approach the archive with a new lens, revealing firsthand accounts of the conservation of Mohenjo-Daro through ethnographic conversations. This approach also tells a story that is broad and uncensored enough to bring equity and justice into the archive. Significantly, and the reason why we're kind of doing this explicitly, is that it rights some of the colonial and caste-based wrongs by witnessing, acknowledging, and celebrating the care work that marginalized people have done as they cared for an ancient city. Now, over a century of research has been conducted at this World Heritage Site, and yet there seems to be so much more that we need to understand about the sociality in the city, particularly on the scale of the neighborhood and household. Through our ethnographic conversations and archival investigations, care has emerged as this generative conceptual approach that transforms the research about Mohenjo-Daro. Care can be thought of as many things, indeed, as Maria Puig de la Bellacasa argues. Care is a contested concept, primarily as it obfuscates easy categorization. And I think what she means in that context is something that, and Juliet Davis, in a book called The Caring City, also points out that in many respects, the conceptual tension that emerges at the point of application is dependent on whether care is utilized as Juliet says, a noun, such as the care, right, or a verb, to care. Early on in care studies, Joan Tronto and Bernice Fisher wrote of care as everything that we do to, and here I'm going to quote, to maintain, continue, and repair our world. End quote. Now, this stance allows for infrastructures of care to shift between subtle distinctions, in particular within the medical and home care industries, just to give you a sense of like how we're thinking through this, right? There's a sense that cities can exhibit infrastructures of care if they are set up for sustainable care practices. And ideally, that would take into account gender, racial, and health equity. And we saw this, like if we think back to the COVID pandemic, this really was front and center at that time. Now, geographers such as Emma Power and Miriam Williams, informed by feminist care research, have argued that when thinking through urban care, there has to be an expanded sense that acknowledges the need for, and here I'm going to quote them, care and care that supports, that supports human and non-human flourishing, end quote. Moreover, they provide an analysis of the location of care that includes interpersonal, but is more about the ways by which welfare, governance, and planning are all part of what provides that sense of care. In their framework, and in others, such as Alam and Houston, the infrastructure of care is informed by, and here I'm going to quote Alam and Houston actually, it's informed by, quote, grounded relationality of care work in all of its diverse forms that are constitutive. They coalesce to form intimate nodes of life support in cities that are quietly remaking forms of sociality, collaboration, democracy, and justice. And this comes from Alam in Houston. So now within this background, what we're looking at then are for indicators of ways we can identify care in the archaeological record, the archive, and the ethnographic record. And so what I've done here is just so that we can kind of follow along the narrative of this talk particularly. We'll be looking at materiality of care. I'm going to be looking at care in the archive and care in the ethnography. Okay, so within this project, let's start with materiality of care. We acknowledge the more than human care that Puig de la Bella Casa, Power and Williams, and Alam and Houston have all invited us to recognize. These are all the folks that I just cited prior. And within this, as Puig de la Bella Casa has said, care, in quotes, implicates different relationalities, issues, and practices. And so I want you to kind of keep that in mind as we think about this. Now, this also resonates deeply with a relational, heart-centered approach to archaeological work, as Keisha Supernaut and others have argued for. The heart-centered approach is one within which care that is simultaneously both a noun and a verb. It can be used simultaneous. And it's also one in which the ways by which we encounter and engage with both human and more than human world as a relation that continues to center respect and consent. So these two concepts become incredibly important as we think of care within this space. In line with this indigenous archaeological methodology and feminist geographers considering the contemporary city, our project then locates care within everyday infrastructure that makes and remakes the materiality of the city as a way to express its relational care, inviting us to focus in on those forms of communication and care between the generations and the spaces within which they live and how they experience human life. Given that a city like Mohenjo-Daro is one of first of its kind in the third millennium BC landscape, folks engaged in this urban experience had a stake in ensuring its success. Michael Smith has approached the study of ancient cities through a lens that takes into consideration the quality of life. Archaeologically, he argues for measuring this by looking at the household standard of living, indicated by house size, diversity of household possessions, and residential stability. Certainly, a standard of living and stabilities are markers for a certain quality of life, but the decisions to maintain those standards, or even more simply, the intergenerational decisions to build on the same walls, maintain the same footprint, and preserve the ways of moving through a city in the neighborhoods of Mohenjo-Daro, speaks to a different relation with and within the architecture. Juliet Davis outlines the many ways one might identify the materialities of care within the urban form, infrastructures, and urban transformation processes. The materiality of care at Mohenjo-Daro specifically can be identified through the repair and restoration of household units through time, through the upkeep and maintenance of sanitation infrastructure, and through urban design decisions that are made with multiple stakeholders in mind, such as the location of wells and trash bins. Each of these aspects can be documented in detail utilizing remote sensing, which is precisely what we've come in to do. So now remote sensing allows us to make specific kinds of maps. And so we at LIAV, what we're working on currently is how to bring together these narratives and stories and data sets and embed them with geospatial specificity. So we've turned to visualize care through deep mapping. And through the work of early Spandoni, we understand deep mapping to be, and here I'm going to quote, and you can follow along right here, a multi-layered digital cartographic representation that allows map creators to annotate and illustrate geographical and social space in various ways, often using multimedia elements, commenting, and superimposable layers, end quote. And so that's one of the projects that we're currently working on. And it turns out it's more complicated and intricate than I had previously envisioned. And so it's taking a lot longer because we really need to get it right? Because the idea is to make data accessible to everyone. But just to give you a sense of what sorts of things we're trying to integrate into our maps, basically all of this, right? So the artifacts, the infrastructure, the architecture, the urban design, they're all part of a map that allows us to trace how care might be understood. So for the purposes of this study, as you know, we're looking at DKG. Now, this is a somewhat familiar space because we just flew over it. We just looked at it on a map. You just did a 360. In fact, the 360, I was standing right on this side of this pink, right in there, just to give you a sense of where we are. Now, this area provides a rich information resource at Mohenjo-Daro. It features some of the most robust extant contiguous architecture linked to alleys and major roadways, evidence for houses at least 2 stories tall, as indicated by the tall height of the shaft wells. And we have staircases that are going up, distinct residential and potentially non-residential buildings. We have extensive waste and water management. We have bathing platforms. Excavations have also provided ample evidence of the rebuilding of walls, right? So they're actually maintaining and rebuilding walls and ensuring intergenerationally that those walls stay standing. So there's a lot of repair that's happened that we can see. We also have lots of artifact scatters that indicate activity through time. It's precisely these activities that index rebuilding and maintenance of architectural features that can be documented and thus coded as markers of care. So in order to visualize that, we made a few 3D models based on the information we had in plans, the original field text, and any affiliated information that we could locate about each time period in order to make each level accurate. So this is, again, we're going to be looking specifically at this area right here. So what we did is we've created these 3D models, right? And this is based on these plans, but it's also based on text. Sometimes there's things in the text that isn't in the plans because that's just the nature of excavations. Sometimes it makes it, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's in notes. We also use section drawings as well as other sort of forms of notation. And then we extruded the walls. These are from the earlier layers. I just wanted to show you kind of all of them and how we're actively doing this. Now, this was 3D work that was done with one of my students, Priyashi Galiawala, and John Sukuoglu. So we kind of all worked together to figure out what was the best way for us to represent the same footprint. So now these are all on top of one another, right? They're actually on top of one another and they're maintaining the same footprint. So those large walls that you saw going up actually are the wall at the bottom is being used as a foundation for the wall at the top. Just visually, if you look at it, this is the earliest time period up on the top. As you just look through this, you can see how the complexity increases and changes and shifts. And that is what I think is really interesting, is that they don't change the footprint, but they shift the complexity and the use of space maybe, and the ways in which people move through and traffic bodies through. Maybe traffic isn't the best word, but the ways in which we kind of see bodies moving through those spaces. Here's another way to see the same information, right? And this work was done by Sarah Eigner. So the important takeaway here is how usually at archaeological sites through time, the orientation of domestic units and other non-residential units might shift and change. Like you can tell the different time periods because things are moving here and there. But what we see here at Mohenjo-Daro is a commitment to form and place. And that maintenance of whatever significant value that deemed important to continue to replicate required a great deal of care. And that's kind of what we're looking at as we're taking a look at this material. So now, in addition to remote sensing work, what we're doing is thinking through care at the site through the archive. And there's so much there. I'm sorry, I have to kind of keep moving. I'm just looking at the time and I'm like, oh my. So we're also thinking of care at the site through the archive and ethnographic exchange, particularly how labor and caretaking of the site can be recognized as being integral to Mohenjo-Daro's continued existence. Each of these capacities is located within the infrastructure that maintained the city in the ancient and historic past, as well as in this contemporary moment. At the core, in some sense, this project then is about people who maintain infrastructures of care in antiquity, in history, and in the contemporary time. So we recognize Mohenjo-Daro as belonging to a history of discovery by those who, within a colonial framework, conduct archaeological field study as military campaigns. And as part of those campaigns, construct and define the site as an archaeological site. These campaigns are embedded within systems of governance, specifically colonial governance, and those engaged in that system replicate the impact of that system merely by participating in it. Heralding tenets of modernity, the Archaeological Survey of India at the time of discovery at the site was the quintessential colonial bureaucratic machine. And it's within this bureaucracy that we aim to uncover, to center, and to amplify, and even celebrate those who otherwise would be overlooked, ignored, or deemed unimportant within the archive. We recognize these folks as doing the care work on the site. Now, the particular archive that we had access to spans between there's one document from 1932, but mainly from 1936 to 1946. Now, this is a decade prior to partition. Partition happened in 1947. That's when independence happened. And holds within it, in this decade, it holds within it a bureaucratic infrastructure that put into place through which the everyday colonial control is structured and maintained. During this time period, excavations were not actively taking place in that 10-year period, but the site and the museum were maintained, cared for, and protected. And what's really interesting is that this is exemplified through the keeping and reporting of money spent. So literally receipts. They had receipts. So we looked at the receipts. So these muster rolls and receipts illustrate the structural holding of bodies in place through the documentation of work done at the site and salaries given to the caretakers of the site. So let me first show you. These are two curators and the curator's assistant who are doing, this is the archival material there, and we were working with them on figuring out how to do not just the documentation, but then making it OCR, so to have character recognition. So it was something that could be searchable. That's still a work in progress. We're still working through that. Okay, so here are some of these archives, just to give you some sense of what they look like. There's so many people who are mentioned in the archive, right? And so one of the things that we've tried to do in order to understand care is to kind of pull through a narrative of one character, one individual, and kind of look at their story. So one such emergent story is that of a Chowkidar Najamuddin, and you'll see his name as number one up here on the muster roll, and it's also he's mentioned here because he's advocating for more clothing because it's really cold in the winters. So one of the earliest mentions of Najamuddin we encounter is in 1932 by Ernest Mackay. He hired Najamuddin on a temporary basis because he held his work and language skills in very high regard. According to the archive, Najamuddin spoke Urdu, Sindhi, and English. Najamuddin's story illustrates a capacity for self-advocacy, his unique talents, and his commitment to the archaeological site. The archive provides an insight into the ways by which Najamuddin negotiated his space within the colonial bureaucracy, continuously advocating for better working conditions. And that's what you see here on this page, where he's demanding more clothing for winter for all of the folks who work outside. It's quite cold there in the winter. These are stories that are usually hidden within the archival collections. Our aim is to bring recognition to Chowkidars who, like Najamuddin, have worked and lived at the site of Mohenjo-Daro for much of their life, warranting recognition within the history of the site. Perhaps most importantly to this conversation is how they would repeatedly remark on how much they loved and cared for Mohenjo-Daro. And we see that in some of these documents right here, where he's saying explicitly, like they wanted to send him to Delhi, and he was just like, I don't want to go to Delhi. I love Mohenjo-Daro, which is kind of interesting because Najamuddin actually came from Ambala, which is in contemporary India, and it's over 550 miles away. And it's actually closer to Delhi. So you'd think that he would want to be closer to where his home state or his home city would be. But once he came to Mohenjo-Daro and worked for a few years, the documentation shows that he did not want to be transferred to Delhi or anywhere else. And what he claimed was that he belonged to the site and loved with his heart working at and for the archaeological site. So it's interesting to me when I read this in the archive because I heard similar narratives about folks working at the site within the ethnographic conversations, not in the higher officer ranks, but in kind of the everyday care sector folks who made sure the lights were turned off, the offices were locked. They just had a different relationship with the site. Now, just so that you know, there is a back end to this as well. So I'm going to show you really quickly. So I worked with this with one of my graduate students, Sarah Burry, and she's basically gone through and all of the archives that we have are searchable. You can do it by name search, government docs. You can look at people like in terms of who they were, when the date is of their of the archival material, and then we have things like signatures. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about this context though. Now, Alison Mickle has a book, Why Those Who Shovel Are Silent, and it draws attention to archaeological labor and it effectively demonstrates where our blinders are when we speak of doing community-based work. Based on 6 years of engaged ethnographic research, Mickle's research provides a careful articulation of how site workers are and were disciplined into their subject positions to downplay their scientific knowledge and emphasize their traditionalism and simplicity, creating the ideal labor to hire. Although there are other ethnographic studies of archaeological practice, often they focus on the archaeologists and the staff together. Mickle's focus on laboring bodies as a distinct ethnographic space is absolutely essential to undo the colonial violence that holds such bodies in place, specifically within archaeological contexts. And it's a similar impetus that informs the ethnographic engagement of this project. So, a key component of our decolonizing framework is systematically hosting ethnographic conversations of some of the elders in the area who had been hired as workers for various archaeological projects in the past. And we framed these as conversations because when we tried interviews, and we did try interviews, their answers became short and tense, and there was a fear embedded within the fabric of that interaction. So we wanted to kind of have more open interaction. Okay, I'm going to try not to go too fast, but I do want to kind of close up soon. Okay, so unlike interviews, the conversations help us understand the elders' connections to the site, help us share our interests with the communities most connected to the site. Some of the site workers that we conversed with had parents and grandparents who also worked at the site, going back to the first excavations led by John Marshall in the 1920s. In one conversation, in fact, just 2 weeks ago, I was told that the individual who now works at the museum now, but he had in fact been born at the site when his father was employed there because his father had been employed there. And so his entire life is based in these spaces. And it's through those memories and stories that they were told and what they witnessed themselves as children that the story of Mohenjo-Daro really kind of emerges. So our conversations record in an like we recorded audio in an audio. They're memories of what it was like working at the site when the people in charge often did not know any of the local languages, right? That was usually what was happening during the colonial time period. And how the staff on site, that is the chowkidars, the masons, the watchmen, there are so many, ensured that the site itself was always cared for, even when there were multiple barriers. It is, in fact, their repeated use of the concept of care and relational sense of responsibility to the site that continue to emerge as a key aspect of their own work. And as we continue this work, we're bringing together the stories of our interlocutors and elders as a way to open up that archive, particularly as these are the bodies that continue to be held in place by colonial archaeological bureaucracy in a post-colonial state. It's also important to have these conversations in intergenerational capacities and across gender. And so I also spent some time talking to women who are not pictured here for cultural reasons and with children and younger adults. As women were not part of the colonial workforce that was listed in the archive, that at least that we had access to, it was difficult to understand their position within the time frame. I suspect, given the deep history of patriarchy within colonial British attitudes towards women, that women were probably working but were unpaid. I'm still working to understand the role of local women during this time, but it is certainly something I'm curious about because we do see some women in the archival photographs, but they seem to be missing in the muster rolls, right? So having first been, I'm going to wrap it up, having first been invited to work at Mohenjo-Daro in 2018 with the explicit hope that LIA would provide data management, visualization, and accessibility, specifically data accessibility, we have spent the last 6 years working towards that goal. Through this time, we have learned from our partners and collaborators on the ground that without consent, mutuality, and care, the work is extractive. There are conversations with elders at Mohenjo-Daro who have been part of caretaking of the site as labor for conservation or for being the chowkidars. We realize that the deep and in many cases intergenerational attention that was afforded to the archaeological site by families set up particular relationships between the human and more than human. One of our interlocutors framed this relationship by explaining how they took care of the site and how the site took care of them. He said this as a gesture towards the employment it provided, but that framework really opened up a larger sense around care. The elders who had worked at the site over time implicitly and explicitly understood that there was a relationship that was symbiotic and mutual. They spoke of conservation work at the site as something akin to how they might take care of their own homes. Over the course of a few years and many conversations, the centrality of the site to their own lives was conveyed to us, and always through this lens of care. These ethnographic conversations around care traverse time, and care as an ethic allows us to approach archaeological material and the archive with new sets of parameters. And so this question of understanding care at Mohenjo-Daro is one that we've taken as a central guiding uh, sensibility, as well as a research question. And what I've presented today is a work in progress, as I assume all research work always is, or at least it should be if it's going to continue to be generative, right? It's always in process. What we've done is we brought together materiality, the archive, and ethnographic conversations. And I hope what you've gotten from this talk is a sense of how working with the archaeological site, the legacy data, site labor, and archival history allows us to explore the notion of care across time and data sets. And finally, there are those who took care of and supported this work, without whom none of this would be possible. And so I wanted to make sure to acknowledge them. Thank you so much to all of you for engaging with this work, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. Maybe I'll stop sharing so it's easier to see.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rizvi, for a fascinating talk. And my video's off again. Sorry, new computer with very sticky mouse. Okay, there we go. I'm back. Um, Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. I have been watching the question and answer, so if you don't mind, I will ask a few questions that have popped up more than once. One is many people are interested in salt mining. Do you see any evidence of salt mining? You showed in your amazing drone shots that there's a lot of salt. So do you see evidence of salt mining either today or in the past?
No, so the salt, it's actually part of the soil matrix itself, but we don't see any evidence of salt mining in antiquity, at least not that I know of. In areas that are further west, you do have salt lakes.
All right, excellent. Thank you. And there were also quite a few questions about different organization of the site itself in the past, about do you see evidence of social differentiation in terms of materials being used in the buildings? Is there evidence for large scale projects like defensive walls? Basically, what does the housing and the building tell us?
Yeah. So we have a lot of material that shows us differentiation of class very easily. So here's a great example. So as I'd mentioned, the waste management and the infrastructure is very extensive. But if you're on the Acropolis or Mound of the Great Bath, it's lined with gypsum, which is a more rich stone, versus lined with terracotta or lined with just basic limestone, which is done elsewhere. So you can see in the material use that there are, in fact, socio class differences, right? Social status differences. You can also think of it in terms of, do you have a well? So in this area that's been excavated, in the excavated areas, we have over 700 wells. Generally there's a way in which the usual equation is for every house, every 4 or 5 houses, you have at least one well. But then you have some houses. So there are some wells that are outside of the houses in common areas, or ways in which water that can be accessed by many. And then there's some places where you actually have the well on the second floor, right? And so that means like just thinking about like how privileged you must be to be able to have water access on your second floor suggests a socioeconomic difference. We see also these differences in the material artifacts as well. And lots of folks have published about this. So there is material out there for you to look at. I'd recommend looking at harappa.com. There's a lot of that website really has pulled together a lot of articles about this time period.
Right, thank you. Another question that people have been asking is, do you see a difference in the treatment of the people actually, spades in ground, cleaning things? Do you see a difference pre and post partition?
That's a really interesting question. Um, what I don't see that has been changed is the ways in which the colonial bureaucracy is maintained, right? So pre and post partition, the bureaucracy is still there, and the ways in which there are the arrangement of how people ask for leave. Something as simple as that, like I want a vacation. Like you still have the same kind of paperwork. So that hasn't changed. The treatment of people, I think, is something that we would have to, I'd have to think about and do I'd have to have different kinds of conversations, and I'd have to look at the archive to get that sense. And that's hard. That's a hard one to kind of get to. But structurally, if you think of it in terms of systems, the systems, one of the biggest critiques we have with decolonization and with this issue with the post-colonial is that it's post-colonial in that we are no longer like the British are no longer our masters, right? Our colonial masters, but the bureaucratic systems that they put in place are still very much the ways in which things are done, and that are counter to the culture that is there, like on the ground. So there's always this weird kind of disjuncture that happens. But that was a great question. I'm not entirely sure what sorts of data I would need to answer that, or if I could even access that. But I'll keep that in mind as I move through.
All right, thank you. I think we have time for a real quick one. And that is people are asking, you spoke about the connection between the site and people who are like, still literally living on top of them, on top of it. Do you see, like, how far back do you see a connection, either in terms of material culture or in people's perceptions of their relationship to the site? So do people feel that they are related to the people who built the site, who excavated the site in the 30s? Like, how far back does that sense of connection go?
Yeah, another really great question. So it's really interesting because a lot of the older folks I spoke to had these memories of just running through the ruin, like running through the excavated areas as the excavations were happening, right? So they're just like, or like some, I think that was in like George Dale's in the 60s, right? So they're still not that old. But then they tell us stories about their grandparents and their like the sort of stories that kind of came around and what they were told when it was still like all you could see was a little bit of this, like I don't even know if you could see the stupa because I think when Banerjee came, it was just like a big mound, and he just saw some ceramics that he picked up, and he realized it was from the Kushan period. So what they said though was that they were always told that traditionally they walk around the site, not walk through the site, right? And it's because that space was considered to be, haunted is a kind of loose way to kind of think of it, but just something that was not like it wasn't good, but it wasn't bad, but it wasn't something you kind of traversed on. Once the excavations happened, some families still told me that they still did not allow their kids to walk across the site. They'd walk around the site. But then you have folks who are working on the site, right? And those are the people, because they were working on the site, they might have had some quarters. Like John Marshall has a house that's on the site, right? In fact, they've made it into a museum, which is it's a great kind of space where you can see where John Marshall was living. The museum's on the site. People like there people who were staff were had staff quarters on the site, and that's where this person who works in the museum was born. I haven't I had a really interesting conversation actually just a couple of weeks ago with some of the folks who are from the surrounding villages because it's a World Heritage Site. No one's actively living on the site. They've been pushed off. So there are villages surrounding the site, but the folks who are living on the site are those who are actually working on the site. Like if they are. Now I don't even think anyone's living there. But one of the things that he said that I thought was really interesting, he was just like, wouldn't it be, it's so interesting to think about who actually is who actually is from here and that we made like our forefathers may have made this, and how did they make this and how did they think about it? And then what happened to them? Why did we all disperse? And so we had the whole conversation about climate, about changes in population and everything else. But it's there. there's something about the site where people feel like they are connected, but they are not. There's no direct descendancy that anyone is claiming. So the ways in which we have descendant communities here within the United States, we don't have any of those conversations there. But there is a very deep sense that it belongs to Sindh, to that land. There's something about landness that is very much a part of this conversation that shifts it then from a human-centric approach of are we descendants? It's more like this is the land and we belong to it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. That was a very interesting response, a very and brief too, which I appreciate. We don't have time to go into the many questions that were asked about possible internships or visiting the site.
Mhm.
So I hope that people forgive me for not being able to ask those, and perhaps they can reach out to someone at the AIA about that, because I'm sure they have resources. And if nothing else, they have you. So there you go. So please join me in thanking our speaker, Dr. Rizvi, for a wonderful talk on a very interesting site from a very interesting angle. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of you.